Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly livestock market update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grebner. With us, as always, to talk all things markets is University of Missouri Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
Shoot, it's going to be a quick, it'll be a quick chat for us today. Not a lot going on in these back-to-back shortened holiday weeks, but let's recap what happened this week in the markets to kick things off.
Yeah, so it's a limited trade again this week, but if we start on the cattle side, live cattle were about $1.50 higher this week. Again, those feeder cattle markets for the most part have been shut here over the extended holiday period, so nothing really to report there. On the futures side, the February live cattle futures contract, and this is Wednesday to Wednesday, was down about 35 cents, and the January feeder cattle futures contract was down $1.85. Really unchanged this week on the choice box beef price. Moving to the hog side, the cash bone gilt price down 60 cents this week, while that February lean hog futures contract, again, Wednesday to Wednesday, was down 30 cents. The pork cutout value gained this week, up about $2.35.
Everybody's buying that holiday bacon.
That's right. Pushing those belly prices higher this week.
We'll take whatever gains we can make, especially in any aspect of the market right now. Normally, we would talk a little bit of slaughter after we recap markets, but again, week to week, this is the second week in a row with limited slaughter interaction, but I think that might set us up for a pretty aggressive start to 2021 next week.
I would assume so, just given how holidays are going to fall here, that we'll get cranked back up for another big week of cattle and hog slaughter as we get into that first full week of January.
The one report for us to recap and to look back at this week is the Restaurant Performance Index, and not a positive note to end the year.
Yeah, that's right, Megan. So the November numbers came out for us to talk about and are down relative to October. The overall performance index was down a little less than 1%, but really puts it back at 97.5 was what we got from the Restaurant Performance Index today. That puts it back below where we were in August of 2020. So after a couple of months of gain, we've kind of lost that gain. That really had a lot to do with what was a weaker current situation index. That current situation index down 1.5% in November relative to October. Same store sales were down. I think you and I have talked about this is likely coming as we saw more stay-at-home orders put in place in some parts of the country, and just an overall increase in COVID-19 cases probably kept us in a tougher situation when we look at those November numbers out of that Restaurant Performance Index.
It'll be interesting to see just how things end up at the end of the year next month when we talk about those December numbers to see, because we've seen even more COVID cases in recent weeks, and how that kind of plays out to kick off the new year.
Yeah, so in fact, you're probably precursoring correctly that, we could be weaker again come the December numbers. And I think I saw we got roughly 2.5 million doses of COVID vaccine out as of a couple of days ago. So we were, I think, hoping for 20 million vaccinations by the end of the year. So it tells me we're dragging in terms of anticipated vaccinations. We'll see what all that means. I guess I'd just say we still could have a long January, February of some pretty large cases. And of course, we could see us surge a little bit, just given the amount of travel that likely occurred over the Christmas holidays.
Scott, as we kind of wrap things up for us today, just a couple of quick things. Taking a look back at 2020, we've talked about this before, probably ad nauseum. And it's been a year to remember and a little bit of a roller coaster ride. But as we take a look back, let's kind of glance at some of the things maybe that we should keep in the back of our mind when we look at 2020.
Yeah, just remind you said a year to remember. For me, a year to forget.
Well, there's that too.
I'll start there. So what a year. I always laugh because in my younger days, I would look back at a bunch of old data and years old data and go, what happened there? And I can see the very young generation of economists about 2045 or so going, what in the world happened in 2020? It is going to be a data point that stays with us forever. If you kind of look back, a couple of things to me that stick out. Number one, we got when we started really talking about the period of COVID-19 being the worst. So these are the times where we were talking about shutdowns, slowdowns of some of those meat processing plants. We had choice box beef prices in that March 20th through June 12th period, kind of that worst of times, up 37%. Yet we saw fed steer prices that were down 11% relative to the same period year earlier. So we drove a big wedge between those things. As we look at the remainder of 2020, the choice box beef price has actually been 3% below year ago levels. That fed steer price down about 7%. Similar stories going on in pork and chicken generally. But if you remember back where we were in March, I think we were really concerned about just how things were going to unfold for the rest of the year. And for me, I'm just surprised at how well markets seem to behave through what was a very difficult time. I also think we can't forget what's been happening on the trade side of the equation. Beef exports currently being projected for 2020 to be down about 120 million pounds relative to 2019. To me, a lot of that has to do with COVID-19 dragging down economies in places like Japan, Korea, Mexico, et cetera. That might actually bode well for the industry as we look ahead. However, on the pork side, we gained 1 billion pounds of pork exports in 2020, and we can thank China for that gain. So I think that certainly helped hog markets relative to what maybe even you and I talked about some concern as we got in the latter part of 2020, dragging down hog prices. So exports of pork certainly were a bright spot for us in 2020.
When we look at that, I mean, obviously we talk about China impacting pork exports, but it also, and this probably is previewing what we're going to talk about next, looking ahead to 2021, is good news for the beef side of things. But we also, I don't think we cannot talk about African swine fever and not just the impact in China, but with cases in Europe also helping to support increased pork exports or pork buys of U.S. pork, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think absent ASF in China, we likely wouldn't have seen that 1 billion pound increase in U.S. pork exports. ASF is not over. I'm not sure how the remainder of that story plays out, but there could be bigger issues in China yet to come. That could be positive for us in terms of our ability to export more pork to China in 2021. But we have seen that breeding inventory in China start to turn around. And I think a more technologically equipped or larger scale, able to handle some of the issues that ASF has dealt them as they've rebuilt probably helps the Chinese herd continue to grow. If we haven't had ASF here in the United States, if that were to happen, that certainly could be the negative to us exporting more pork out of the United States. But it is important to remember that ASF really set the stage for what happened here in pork markets, both in the U.S. as well as China. And I like to remind us all the time, 2021 pork consumption in China will still be 10 million metric tons below where it was pre-ASF. That's a big hole to fill and could still then give us some positive effects in terms of U.S. pork exports in 2021.
All right. So let's end 2020 on, I'm going to call it an upbeat note. And I'm hoping that you have all good news as we look ahead to 2021. And what are some of the things maybe that you're watching and the industry should probably keep their eyes on as well?
Yeah, so I frankly am optimistic. And the further we get into 2021, the more optimistic I become. But I want to start on the supply side. So fewer cattle. We know that we've been decreasing cow inventory, going to give us less calf crop. I think some of the drought issues that we've seen in the western part of the U.S. only maybe accelerates and makes us lose a few more cows than otherwise would be the case. So the supply side of cattle in very good shape. That ought to be positive for us in terms of prices. I think as some countries, and I'll point to Japan and South Korea again, their own recovery from COVID-19 from an economic standpoint ought to be helpful to get more exports to them. I do believe that the Chinese will import more U.S. beef in 2021. And so I think all those things could really, in the second half of 2021, come together to be nice in terms of some higher beef and cattle prices. On the pork side, hogs and pigs gave us this cut in sow inventory. If that plays out as we get into the latter part of 2021, maybe supplies of pork will be down. I'm not ready to completely call that one yet, but at least not the same growth that we've seen for a while happening there. And then it just comes down to the demand side. I get a little concerned about China and whether they continue to grow their imports of U.S. pork in 2021. I guess the one I have to watch on the flip side is where do feed costs go? There's a big pull, it seems like, as, again, we can say China is pulling a lot on the imports of things like corn and soybeans. Does that continue in 2021? I think if it does, that could continue to put some pressure up on feed costs. However, I do think we'll plant a lot of corn and soybeans in this country next spring if we have a decent spring to plant. And so we'll wait and see. But those are some of the things to me, Megan, that we'll be paying attention to. And the very last one, so just how does COVID-19 play out in 2021? Do we recover quickly? Is it a delayed recovery? Is it no recovery? Trying to figure out how demand changes as a result of hopefully coming out the other side of COVID-19 leaves me a little unclear about strength or weakness in meat prices as we look ahead.
Do we also keep an eye on what happens as we see a new administration come in and a look at regulations potentially and how that could impact the ag sector and the livestock sector in general?
I certainly think we're going to have to watch as the new administration gets in place. It's going to take a while to figure out some of the areas that they're going to be focused on, but we already know that probably more focus on climate is going to happen in front of us. Adding new regulations, I often say regulations have cost. And so if you put new regulations on the ag industry, it's probably one of the things that, again, hurts in terms of profitability. Now, we'll see if there's incentives for some of those new regulations. We don't exactly know how much of that plays out. I just think it's going to take a little while. For me, what happens with COVID-19? Does the Biden administration push hard for additional assistance as we get into 2021? And can they broker a deal with Congress that puts even more money in folks' pockets as they deal with COVID-19? If so, that could be a strong demand pull. So we'll wait and see.
Plenty for us to talk about in the coming months. That'll do it for us this week as we look ahead to next week a little bit more for us and things start to resume to a more normal weekly routine. What reports do we have next week?
Yeah, so we're going to get monthly trade data next week, Megan, as well as finish the week with a jobs report.
Excellent. We will see you next Friday and in a brand new year.
Happy New Year, Megan.
Happy New Year, Scott, and Happy New Year to all of you as well. To subscribe or to ask questions for the weekly livestock market update, if you have them, you can do so on our website, brownfieldagnews.com. You can click subscribe or submit questions as well. And for all of the great Brownfield podcasts, go to brownfieldagnews.com/podcast. Have a very happy new year, and we will see you next Friday. I'm Megan Grebner for Brownfield.